Hello and welcome here to Blog Solo. And today we're going to be talking about um, imperialism again, even though we've finished our series on that. So there was some legitimate critiques of my episode on Rosa Luxemburg's accumulation of capital, as well as some questions about my opinions on super imperialism that I wanted to go into today. Here at Blog, when I am wrong or misrepresent something or oversimplify something, and I think I did a little bit of column B and a little bit of column C on Rosa Luxemburg, I try to correct it. Now, first for context, I said that Rosa Luxemburg was an under-consumptionist, which she is, and that many people framed the argument disproving her as kind of a proto-Keynesianism. And I think a lot of people did do that. I remember reading both Marxist Humanist Initiative and Marxist Humanist International articles to approximately that point, as well as people interpreting Paul Maddox and Henryk Grossman's critique as being something like that, because they use similar critiques of Luxemburg as they do critiques of Keynes and Keynesianism. But I misexplained the mechanism because I said basically that the working class could not possibly buy enough to through their earnings to recapitulate the cycle. And the actual mechanism is actually much more complicated than that, and it's located as a commenter for me in chapter 25 of the Accumulation of Capital. That chapter is entitled Contradictions Within the Diagram of Enlarged Reproduction, where Rosa Luxemburg critiques Marx directly critiques Marx's mathematical models of which were in diagrams of capital accumulation in volume 2 of Capital. Remember, volume 2 of Capital was not published during Marx's lifetime and was edited together by Engels and then by Kautsky and people later. Her central argument is that these models were theoretically incomplete because they failed to explain who actually buys the surplus product in a closed capitalist system. Now, that sounds like it could be that the working class can't do it because they're immiserated, but that's not her argument, and I think we really need to go into it. So let's break down the key parts of chapter 25. There's a problem of production for production's sake. Luxemburg argues that Marx's diagrams, if followed literally, the capitalist system depends to be a merry-go-round in thin air, according to her. In a diagram, capitalists produce more means of production, aka machines and coal, than to produce even more means of production, meaning that the means of production are themselves, forms of fixed capital, are themselves a commodity sold in the market. And more consumer goods tend to feed an ever-growing army of workers. She points out, though, that according to the diagram, the capital and workers are the only consumers. Let me be very clear on this. They can only consume the value of their wages, which is the surplus value found in their function as labor power sold in the market as a form of variable capital. Let me be as technical as possible here. And capitalists accumulate to increase production, not for personal consumption. So capitalist accumulation is tied back into productive consumption. Now, I'm going to just point out that's not really true anymore. If you look at our currently K-shaped economy, it's still not really high investment into other forms of production. It tends to be invested in the forms of rents or other things. So the question is then, is this true? Well, maybe not, but we can't hold Luxemburg accountable for not seeing the high levels of rents in the modern market. If the goal of capitalism is to realize profit, to convert surplus value into valorizable money, and this money into commodities for use, even if that use is more production, or accumulation, which is futures on capital, who provides the effective demand for the extra goods produced during an economic expansion. Marxist diagrams, according to Luxemburg, assume society consists solely of capitalists and workers, where the capitalist mode of production is universal. Luxemburg argues that this abstraction is theoretically impossible for two reasons. One, the realization or valorization of surplus value becomes really hard. For accumulation to happen, surplus value must be realized, sold for money, and money transferable to other commodities or goods, because again, if money is not transferable for other things, it's really kind of useless. If capitalists are simply selling to each other and their workers, they are just moving the money in a circle. They cannot realize the total surplus value needed to expand the system from within the same system. Thus, there is the need for third parties. It concludes that capitalism requires non-capitalist social strata or outlying fields, peasants, artisans, colonies, to buy the surplus product. So total proletarian and bourgeoisification would actually collapse the system. And imperialism, or what she would call accumulation by imperialism, would serve as an offset, but again, there's a limit to that. Once the entire world has gotten into the loop and all the classes are either bourgeoisified or proletarianized, things should fall apart, according to Luxemburg. Now, there's another critique actually made by myself and by the commenter who was talking to me about what I misrepresented, that what outside is very vague and encompasses stuff both within the capitalist system, just not in the two primary contradictory classes, and outside of it. And what makes the outside not capital is also not completely clear once they start trading in the capitalist system. So you can raise that concern and it's valid, but we're not going to do that exactly yet beyond what I just did, because we want to understand this chapter. Luxemburg highlights that there's a technical flaw as she sees it in Marx's two diagrams. They assume the organic composition of capital, the ratio of machines to labor, remains constant. Not that the amount of machines to labor is constant, but the ratio remains constant. Luxemburg argues that in reality, capitalism constantly increases labor productivity, meaning the amount of constant capital, machines, and raw materials grows much faster than the amount of variable capital, labor power sold on the market for wages. When the increasing productivity is factored in, the imbalance between the capacity to produce and the capacity to consume becomes more severe, leading to a surplus of goods that the internal market cannot possibly absorb. And we'll come back here, because that still might sound like we're talking about you could do like currency things to stimulate domestic consumption, and actually Luxemburg doesn't believe that. And we'll get into that in a minute. Thus, Luxemburg attacks most proportionality theories, particularly theories like Tugan-Baranovsky, who has not come up a ton in this show. I mentioned them a few years ago when I was going through various defectors of Marx and Chartalism, and Tugan-Baranovsky was part of Marxist. I think he might not have stayed a Marxist. Who was influential in people like Joseph Schumpeter, even. But anyway, he comes up a fair amount in late 19th century, early 20th century Chartalism and Marxism. But he's not as remembered as an important figure today. I might do a video on him sometime just because I find him interesting. But anyway, who argued that as long as production is kept in the right proportion, capitalism could expand indefinitely, and this could be handled through management. Luxemburg dismisses this as reckless and a Marxist. She argues that capitalism is not just a technical system of proportions, but a system driven by a hunger for profit, which inevitably runs into the limit of restricted social consumption. Thus, in the conclusion of her chapter, Luxemburg argues that Marxist diagrams were intended to show the circulation of capital, that they should not be mistaken for a proof that capitalism can function as a self-contained system. The deep and fundamental antagonism between unlimited drive to produce and unlimited power to consume is what forces capitalism to constantly expand into non-capitalist territories, leading directly to her version of the theory of imperialism. Remember, we talked about her version is different because it's kind of an under-consumptionist version, as opposed to the overproductionist version you see in Lenin. But Lenin's overproductionist version also assumes that part of what we're doing with imperialism is getting cheaper inputs and cheaper labor, as well as dumping goods on the market. But you're dumping goods on the market to tie people into debt, peonage, and this, that, and the other. So it's not just to fix this one little flaw in the capitalist system, but both of them agree that there's a flaw in the capitalist system which causes the need for constant expansion outside of itself. In short, Luxemburg thinks capitalism in one country is basically impossible. Many things in one country are basically impossible, but nonetheless, we have to go into here. What confused me about this is she makes an argument about use value, and use value is something Marx explicitly says in the economic and philosophical manuscripts that you should not use as a calculation in political economy, because potential uses for a commodity are based on your imagination for them. How are you going to use stuff? Well, how can you think to use it? I mean, like, use values are limited by the usage of things in the world, but they're not limited by anything else other than the uses of things in the world and their consumption and whether or not you can use them more than once when you do use them. Luxemburg emphasizes use value to show that capital accumulation is not a mathematical problem of value, but a physical problem of material requirements. And I'll get into that because this threw me off, and I thought maybe Luxemburg was making a bigger mistake than I think she's making. I still think she's probably making a mistake, but we should go into it a little bit. All right. Her argument regarding use value centers in the natural form of surplus product and its relationship to technical progress. And that's actually something we don't see a lot when people talk about use values. Luxemburg argues that for accumulation to occur, the surplus value cannot remain in the form of money. Money must be materialized in things that have specific use values. Otherwise, holding money forever and never valorizing it means that it's not useful. If you don't spend money ever, and no one does, then it has no real purchasing power. So the constraint to expand production the next year, a portion of the year's surplus must be physically consist of means of production, raw materials, and machinery, aka usually industrial throughputs and fixed capital, and the means of subsistence, food, clothing for workers, things for workers to use and enjoy, etc., things for the bourgeoisie to use or enjoy. If the surplus product consists of luxury goods destined for only personal consumption of capitalists, it is a drain to the very dregs and no accumulation can occur. That's why, for example, if you think about Luxemburg's argument, there isn't really that much growth in the feudalism because anything converted upwards is actually converted directly into use values immediately. And yeah, you can expand that a little bit by squeezing the peasantry, but you're not going to grow a whole lot. Therefore, physical composition use value of the total social product dictates whether growth is even possible. If you can't use the stuff, you can't valorize the stuff, surplus tends to stall unless you have rents and other things stamping in. So what does use value have to do with increasing productivity, specifically considering Marx says don't use use value as a category of a political economic calculation? Well, Luxemburg uses the physical nature of use value to critique the static nature of what she sees happening in Marx's diagrams. She points out that as labor productivity improves, the physical volume of use values grows faster than the exchange values can. So basically, people can't use everything that's being made no matter what you did. It's not just a matter of stimulating production by currency manipulation. You literally can't physically use it all. Technical problem means that Department 1, the means of production, must produce larger and more complex proportions of the total product compared to Department 2, which is consumer goods. She argues that Marx's diagram fails to account for these changing physical requirements. The technical basis thus disrupts the balance between the two departments. This leads to a problem with use value versus realization. The most critical point she's making in terms of use value is it's the dead end of production for production's sake. She notes that while the diagram shows a physical loop, coal produces iron, iron produces machines, machines produces more coal. This loop ignores the ultimate purpose of use value, which is to actually use stuff for your needs. But remember, Marx had said he doesn't consider use value in his calculations, and he doesn't think anyone should, because what I said, use values are variable, and uses are probably more numerous than you realize. Luxemburg asserts that the production of constant capital machines never take place for its own sake, but only because of this capital is eventually needed for products to pass through the individual consumption. If use values produced through the machines are only used to make more machines, the system is producing for no purpose whatsoever, not even the valuation of capital. She argues that there must be a final consumer outside of the capitalist worker loop who actually wants and uses the end product as the sake of use value. And where are you going to find them but classes outside of that class antagonism and imperialized nations? Luxemburg's point is that the value requirement of the diagram, the need for profit, eventually clashes with the use value realities of the market. Marx's point would be you can't calculate use values because they're largely socially limited and even somewhat subjective. Your use value for a thing is limited to your imagination of how to use it and its physical capacity to be used that way. The unlimited expansive capacity of productive forces creates a mountain of physical goods with limited expansive capacity of social consumption, which wages or other forms of capital can absorb without creating a closed loop and being subject to the problems of that. The physical surplus of use values is what necessitates the expansion into non-capitalist markets and non-capitalist portions of capitalist society. And the non-capitalist markets leads to this theory of accumulation, and thus we're off to the races for Luxemburg's theory of imperialism. But I want to talk about Bukarin's response to this. Now, Bukarin wrote his book partly in response to Kautsky, and he also was responding to Luxemburg a little bit in his, I think, Imperialism in the World Economy. But he wrote an essay in 1924 or 1925. I believe it's 1920. I always get the exact year off on this one, called Imperialism and the Accumulation of Capital, which is a critique of Luxemburg. And particularly relevant to us here is chapters 4 and 5. Nikolai Bukharin delivers a systemic revolt to Luxemburg's theory of imperialism. While he respects her revolutionary intent, he argues that her economic logic is fundamentally flawed and actually weakens the Marxist understanding of reality. And here's his arguments. Bukarin accuses Luxemburg of failing to understand Marx's abstract method. The individual versus social error, which she makes, is that, according to Bukarin, she is wrong to claim that the volume 1 of capital only deals with individual capital. He asserts that all volumes of capital deal with social capital at different levels of extraction. And Luxemburg argued that you cannot abstract from third persons, non-capitalist producers when discussing accumulation. Bukarin counters that if you must include them in circulation selling goods, you must include them in production buying new materials. He argues that her dual method, abstracting one area but not another, thus becomes logically inconsistent. There's another place where he points out a disagreement. Luxemburg view as capital expands to realize, sell surplus goods to collect, to valorize the surplus value, that it cannot sell internally, so it must do so in the ways that I explained to outside issues. Bukarin's view is capitalism expands to find higher rates of profit because it's not the absolute problem that Luxemburg's talking about, but the rates that are a problem. Hence, the tendency of the rates of profit to fall and to push for super profits. Bukarin argues that the accumulation is theoretically possible in a pure capitalist society, contradicting Luxemburg, but capitalists expand into non-capitalist areas because they can get cheaper labor, cheaper raw materials, and sell for higher profit margins there. Believing Luxemburg obscures the reality of exploitation, focusing only on the difficulty of selling goods in a closed circle. And I think Bukarin has a point on that. I mean, I think he has a point on her definition of outside being a little bit vague. The inability to explain modern imperialism is another key thing that Luxemburg points out in chapter 4. Bukarin argues that Luxemburg's definition of imperialism as a struggle for the remains of the non-capitalist world is too narrow and was already historically inaccurate for the 1920s. He talks about Ruhr. He points out that France's occupation of the German Ruhr, a highly developed capitalist area, cannot be explained by Luxemburg's theory because it is in a non-capitalist milieu. In fact, whatever that means, he's not sure, but that wouldn't apply to the Ruhr and to a lot of other places. He critiques her for ignoring monopolies, trust, and finance capital altogether, basically saying that Marx is not wrong, but there's other developments that have happened that are consistent with Marx's work and that explain some of the things that Luxemburg is missing. By focusing only on the non-capitalist, what we would call periphery, she misses the struggle between the advanced capitalist powers themselves for world domination, including in their own borders and in highly developed capitalist places. From Luxemburg's perspective, annexing a capitalist territory would make no sense. It doesn't solve the realization problem that she's describing. But Bukarin argues that imperialism is about the redivision of the world amongst monopoly powers, regardless of whether or not the territory is capitalist or anything else. Thus, Luxemburg cannot be right about what is driving imperialism, according to Bukarin. I think he's also got a pretty good argument here. Bukarin concludes that Luxemburg confuses capitalism in general with a specific epoch of imperialism. He thinks that we have epochal capital. Now, one of the interesting debates in Marxism that I haven't got into is whether or not the divisions of capitalism, which you'll see me here use too, and I think, they were originally coming from the regulation school, such as Fordist, monopoly capital, Fordist capital, which is a development of that, neoliberal capital, whatever the hell we're in right now, early forms of capitalism like sometimes it's called entrepreneurial capital or mercantile capital. That doesn't come out of Marxism, but it's actually highly useful to describe rearrangements of society to return profitability. So neoliberalism creates profitability by further merging things with finance, breaking down big monopolies into petite bourgeois-like competition, but that competition is not on an actual market, but a market created by the state, etc. Fordism consolidates a lot of things, consolidating the management of capital and even bringing the workers to the chair and operating a closed industrial society that is highly productive but needs an outlet for that production. Hence imperialism. Monopoly capitals, when the firms are consolidated into monopoly, or oligopoly, or monopsony power. They're not quite the same thing, but for our purposes here, they're close enough. And the state gets more and more involved in capital regulation, and the states act like competing firms between each other. Entrepreneurial capital is about accumulation of wealth in the hands and the beginnings of the structuralization of capital through the stock market. We can go on through these various periods. Mercantile capital in most places will be seen as pure accumulation. But Bukarin is before that use of regulation school things, but he is one of those people who periodizes capital. He does think the central contradiction of capital is around. It hasn't gone away, at least, but it's been mitigated by finance capital. And he chastises Luxemburg's view because it would be always around in capital, but she, according to Bukarin, she can't explain why imperialism emerged in its specific form at a specific point in time in the 19th century, which would be different from like the settler or colonial capital of the 16th and 17th century and the national consolidation projects of the 16th, 17th, and 18th century. Now, today we have this debate about whether or not imperialism began with the onset of capital. I think it does. Although its nature changes, and that's why I think like the imperialism of the 19th and early 20th century is kind of specific to that time period, whereas settler colonialism in the 16th and 17th century is also specific to that time period. Now, there are some people who use a Maoist logic to argue that actually imperialism predates capitalism, and capitalism may even be a secondary contradiction or even an epiphenomena of imperialism. Now, you can see what that would do to a lot of the arguments of Marxism, but it is something that has come up on a lot. I mean, there was basically a crypto debate around it between Vivek Chebber and Maoist. But it's very interesting to read Bukarin on this, because basically he's saying if you make imperialism transhistorical, you don't understand the specific form at a specific time. So looking at a tendency in all of capitalism would have a hard time explaining very specific parts of capitalism's particular development. Now, in chapter 25, chapter 5 of Imperialism and Accumulation of Capital, titled The Reproduction of the Social Capital, Bukarin moves from criticizing Luxemburg's methodology to providing his own positive solution to the problem of accumulation. And I'm just going to go over it because it's interesting. It didn't come up in our discussion of Bukarin's notions of imperialism, because it's not in that book. It's in a later book that I'm using now. He seeks to prove that capital accumulation is theoretical possible within a pure capitalist country, therefore dismantling the foundation of Luxemburg's imperialism theory. I don't know that I completely agree with this theory, but I want to articulate it as best as I can. Bukarin presents his own mathematical models to show that as long as certain proportions are maintained between Department 1 and Department 2, the system can expand indefinitely without third persons. And he sounds like Turgen Baranovsky here. I mean, he really does, actually. I wonder how much he was pulling from Turgen Baranovsky. I might have to look it up. He argues that Luxemburg's mistake was assuming that because the workers cannot consume the entire product, the surplus cannot be realized. But that's not the point. Just because they can't, the entire product can't be used and consumed, doesn't mean the surplus can't be realized somewhere. Bukarin counters that the demand for surplus comes from capitalists themselves when they choose to reinvest as well as consume luxury goods. So reinvestment actually does do something with the surplus. And in his view, the surplus of Department 1 is consumed by the expanded production needed in Department 2 and vice versa, theoretically. He's not arguing this is what capitalists actually do necessarily, but that it's theoretically coherent. Bukarin distinguishes between the technical mathematical possibility and the historical reality, though. He admits that in reality, capitalism is never perfectly proportional. It's always prone to crises of overproduction for the very profit reasons that Luxemburg points out. It's just that the idea that it couldn't in theory be balanced is wrong. He argues that these crises are due to the anarchy of production, lack of plannings, not a fundamental mathematical impossibility of realization, as Luxemburg claimed. Now, I actually do think this is interesting because Bukarin becomes one of the authors of the concept of socialism in one country, and he was a big proponent of markets under the NEP, but that was mostly to keep the peasants from revolting, which he thought would happen under the Trotsky and then later on Stalin's slightly different modification of the plan of the collectivization of public land. Of peasant land, not public land. For Bukarin, realization is a problem of balancing different branches of industry themselves, which is not easy to do, not a problem of finding a consumer outside the system. So if you think about this, Bukarin does think you could probably theoretically manage capital within one country by this view, which is why I'm not sure I buy it. But I do admit that his point about the theoretical issue, at least in terms of pure logic, that it's not like Luxemburg does not come up with an absolute logically clad case for her rejection of Marxist tables. Bukarin and then Grossman and other people, I'm going to mention Grossman again, and Paul Maddock, reject Luxemburg's theory that as a form of under-consumptionism, the idea that capitalism collapses because the workers don't have enough money to buy what the markets they make, or because that's what I accused her of last time, and people got mad at me about it, or just can't physically use the products because the output just doesn't work. According to Bukarin, capitalists don't go abroad because they can't sell at home. They go abroad because the profit rates are low and declining at home, and profits elsewhere could be made through cheaper materials, lower wages, through uneven development, and lower social reproduction costs because of the uneven development and monopoly control. He also argues that during finance capital, the national state becomes a tool for these massive monopolies to seize territory and gain resource competitive edge over other national monopolies. Now, I find it interesting they're arguing that this is solely a 19th century phenomenon because, like, I guess we could indicate that there are some early precursors. Like I said, the settler colonial states in the Americas in particular. But if you think about the development of the British East India Company and the Dutch East India Company and all that, you start seeing that there might be something to this in a very specific way, because that was not about just finding surplus markets. Bukarin concludes, though, that Luxemburg's collapse theory leads a mechanical view of the end of capitalism that doesn't have the need for political revolution or political viability. You'll see this today in debates about Grossman too, actually. In Luxemburg's view, capitalism collapses when it runs out of non-capitalist outside of capital third persons to exploit for the valorization of profits. Bukarin argues that this is dangerous for revolutionary movement because it suggests a predetermined date to the end of capitalism. And he argues that capitalism will come from its internal contradictions, not external ones. Crisis, wars, class struggles that are generated by the hunger for profit, regardless of whether or not there are these third persons in the world. And for these contradictions to be settled in a way positive for a proletariat, the proletariat actually has to, do something about it and not just wait. Now, I'm going to refer specifically for the Grossman Luxemburg debates to an article by Kirill Ludinov, and I'll link in the show notes, which talks about Grossman and Luxemburg as two different ends of crisis theory. Whether or not the end of capitalism is triggered by a failure to sell goods, circulation, or a failure to produce enough profit, which is production. And you would think, oh, well, selling goods is production, but not entirely. While both thinkers, revolutionaries, believe that capitalism had an absolute limit, they disagree vehemently on where that limit was located, and Luxemburg has a much simpler model than Grossman. Although Grossman's been critiqued by people like Andrew Kleiman and other people for also overcorrecting that. So I might do a video on that too. I did get mad once at some of Andrew Kleiman's characterizations of Grossman, but there are a couple of things in it that I think Kleiman might have been right about. All right. So Luxemburg argues that in a pure capitalist society consisting of only workers and capitalists, no lumpen proletariat, no petit bourgeois, etc., it is mathematically impossible to sell the total surplus product produced. Workers don't have enough money to buy it. They can't consume it all, even if they do have enough money to buy it. And capitalists only want to reinvest it, not consume it all, because why would they consume it all? And we talked about the problems with that. To survive, capitalism must expand into non-capitalist environments, colonies, former classes like peasants, artisans, lumpen proletariat even, who can buy the surplus. Capitalism collapses when it has capitalized the entire globe. Once there is no more non-capitalist markets to serve the surplus, accumulation stops. Ludendorff points out that Luxemburg uses Marx's social reproduction schemes volume 2 as flawed, as we pointed out, because they seem to show that a system could grow forever in a closed loop. And I actually do think that there's no way anything can go together in a closed loop, but I also agree with Bukarin that technically, theoretically, it's not incoherent to believe from the models given in an abstract way that they could. Grossman responds primarily in the law Accumulation and Breakdown, 1929, that shifts focus back on the process of production. Grossman rejects Luxemburg's under-consumptionist focus. He argues that the problem isn't that there isn't enough buyers, but there isn't enough surplus value, period, produced to sustain the amount of machinery and technology, constant capital already in existence, and still maintain a profit, particularly as variable capital gets squeezed. Following Marx's law of the tendency of the rate of production to fall, Grossman argued that as technology replaces human labor, the value of profit drops because market competition drives prices down, but there's a limit to the value changes involved in technology. So eventually, the variable capital expenses eat up a lot of the profits, and they're not exploitable as variable capital. Excuse me. The constant capital expenses eats up a lot of profits and not as exploitable as variable capital. I'm going to leave some of these mistakes in because I get why people get confused in this terminology, because even I do, as I'm just trying to spout it off. Eventually, the absolute mass of profit becomes insufficient to feed both the capitalists and fund the next round of more expensive technology. Using a mathematical model that he extended over 35 years, Grossman intended to prove that accumulation eventually chokes on itself and the system breaks down not because it can't sell goods to outsiders and thus accumulate through valuation, but that it no longer has the profits to produce the goods in any way that matters. Ludendorff intervenes here in some interesting ways, and that's what I want to talk about. Grossman accuses Luxemburg of taking Marx's social reproduction schemes too literally. He argued that those schemes were simplified models, abstractions to show how the circulation would work if there were no crisis, not a description of how capitalism actually works. For Luxemburg, imperialism is a search for markets. For Grossman, imperialism is a search for higher profit rates, just like it is for Bukarin and Lenin and most people, to counteract the falling rate of value at home. Now, what makes Grossman a little different from Bukarin is while Bukarin and Lenin recognize the falling rate of profits as a problem leading to imperialism and the search for super profits, it's not as big of an issue. They're not spending as much time theoretically working that out as Grossman is. Grossman felt that Luxemburg's theory was too voluntaristic. That's interesting because Bukarin thought it was too deterministic, that it relied on the system running out of space. He wanted to prove that capitalism was objectively driven by its own internal logic of production, which would lead to a more firmer scientific basis of the inevitability of revolution. Now, what does Ludendorff conclude from all this? Ludendorff's focus is on the lack of demand and the role that peripherally helps explain the globalized nature of modern capitalism and debt-driven consumption. Grossman's focus on overaccumulation and the collapse of profitability remains essential for understanding why the major industrial economies experience long periods of stagnation despite having plenty of markets, which also wouldn't make sense in Luxemburg's schema. And I think that's actually probably the best argument against it. Ludendorff, ends up mostly siding with Grossman, but maybe in a way that admits that there is some truth in practice to Luxemburg's insights about searching for a new market. And again, I'll link that article in show notes for you. So I'm going to talk about Karl Kautsky, the ultra-imperialism theory, and why I said that, there's an argument to be made that the period after World War II looked like ultra-imperialism, but we have to admit that if that's the case, it doesn't follow the logic Kautsky laid out. And I want to get into that a little bit. So there have been a rehabilitation of Kautsky's super-imperialism thesis, particularly in the 90s and aughts. One that I was initially in on. At first, I was actually pretty sympathetic to the super-imperialism argument post-World War II. While Leonard argued that imperialism was the highest stage of capitalism, characterized by inevitable war between national powers, Kautsky suggested the capitalists might eventually realize that war is too expensive and risky, and he proposed that they would form a holy alliance of international cartels to exploit the world jointly. This author and me thinks that he might have accidentally been right about what the shape of the post-World War II and early post-Cold War era is, but because his logic about how we got there is wrong means we can't really apply it to our own day. If you look at the U.S.-led security architecture that dominated from the end of the Cold War to, I don't know, when we blew up the rules-based international order by 2009 or whatever, a major piece of the modern global order operates under a single security umbrella, which is primarily led by the G8, or at the time of the article was written, the G7, the IMF, the World Bank, and NATO. Thus, ultra-imperialism can look like a military ally where the major capitalist powers no longer fight each other over colonies or markets and maintain a global legal and financial infrastructure that provides property and capital flows everywhere, but the U.S. maintaining blue water trade, the maintaining of banks, making fiat currency possible across the globe, strong forex markets, etc. That's foreign exchange markets for currency. And the article actually draws a comparison to Kautsky's ultra-imperialism and Francis Fukuyama's in the history. I think it's a little bit weak, but I want to talk about it because both theories posit a final stable state of human government where liberal democracy and integrated global markets are there to resolve ideological conflicts. And it does look like that the end of history was essentially a realization of Kautsky's dream. But there's limits to that order, and I think this article is actually somewhat interesting in being somewhat predictive of things that we would see today. The final section of the article addresses why ultra-imperialist stability is currently fracturing, even as early as the aughts, much less where we are now in the 2020s, and talks about the stress test. One is the rise of China, which operates on a state capital development model. I'm not going to argue about whether or not it is capitalist, but it's clearly plugged into the global capitalist system, and that has to be dealt with. And if this will trigger a return to inter-imperialist rivalries between states aligned with China and not. So you have a multipolar world that has a new Cold War between different major, or what Alexander Duhon calls civilizational powers. There's also economic stagnation. The piece argues that unified management of the world cannot solve the internal crisis of unprofitability. Thus, too many recessions, which, again, we've seen, would start breaking down the globalized, frictionless economy. And the globalization of capital never got rid of national security states, which means that ultra-imperialism and the end of history is always fragile and prone to breaking down back into nationalism conflict. And I don't know, are you looking around? Seems like we're living through that right now, aren't we? Although, again, even in the height of the unipolar order, there was proxy conflicts everywhere. Now, it is true that nuclear weapons mean that you're not going to see a lot of direct engagements between the major capitalist empires. And it's also true that, describing China as just, state capitalist in the same way that other capitalist countries might go into periods of state capitalism, which is, state-involved monopoly cartels, is also a little misleading, although beyond scope of today's video. And I hate to get into the whether or not China is socialist or communist or capitalist debate. I tend to think that it is ran by socialists, but is currently in a phase of state capital to get outside investment and hopes to pivot into a phase of more socialistic development. Although the details around that remain vague. And that seems to be what Xi and actually Hu Jintao and people before him's Politburo speeches indicated. But we also have to remind ourselves that in 1982, the constitution of the PRC actually declared that they had already achieved socialism. So I don't know. what even they claim. But it's an interesting problem to consider. So while we may have had a temporary thing that looks like ultra-imperialism, you have to remember that it came from military and economic cooperation, that the cost of war, well, that hasn't stopped anybody. The United States is spending more in the military than any military that's ever existed ever, even when it isn't in war with other major capitalist powers. So that's not a check either. So if Kotsky's right, it's not because he's right about the logic of it. All right. So we end our first series on imperialism. I'm going to do a couple other series. I'm going to do What is Politics on Plato. I'm doing a bunch of education related article discussion-y things that are going to come out. But I will come back to imperialism maybe after I do one other term and another thing, because I do want to get to imperialism post-Lenin. We still all, with the exception of Grossman and late Bukarin, not early Bukarin, still dealing with basically pre-Lenin frameworks that led up to Lenin's framework. So we'll come back to that. This has been a long series. I hope you got a lot out of it. I'm glad to take a break. Protect your peace. Like and subscribe. Hit the bell. Leave a comment, even if you hate me, because it helps me. If you don't want to help me, shut up. That also, that probably does the most damage to me. As far as the algorithm is concerned. You can find the free podcast of interviews. If you don't have money and can't subscribe to Patreon, I would appreciate a review or just some stars somewhere where you get your podcast, like Spotify. Thumbs up if you like it. Subscribe, hit the bell, get the notifications, because I'm not monetized and I don't always come up in your algorithm unless you really prompt it to. Take care. Godspeed. Protect your peace. And always remember to keep fighting for a better tomorrow.